There's one more thing we need to do before we exit the mesher, and that is to label the boundaries. In the Fluent solver, we cannot click on a boundary and set the boundary condition. We will have to set boundary conditions based on boundary labels. And it's like, instead of touching your nose like this, you're trying to touch it like this, and I cannot even do that without breaking my arm, which might not be a good idea. And this is because of legacy stuff. Fluent was a completely different code that got integrated into the Workbench interface, and so there are these limitations coming in from legacy technology. If I go to the mesher, I can actually now highlight geometry and zoom into the inlet. Okay, so you can zoom out here, say zoom to fit, and then zoom into the inlet and select the edge selection filter and select the inlet, and then right click and say create name selection. And we can give it a suitable name. I'll just call it inlet. Then I will zoom out and zoom into the outlet, click on it, and then right click and say create name selection, and I'll call it outlet. Again, I'll zoom out, and then I have one boundary condition for the two horizontal edges on the lower side. So I'll click on the first one, I'll zoom in here, I'll hold down the control button, control key, and select the second one, and then say create name selection, and I'll call that center line. And I will now, for the top boundary, I have separate boundary conditions for the energy equation for the unheated and heated part. So let's give them two labels. So select the unheated boundary and say create name selection, and I'll call it wall underscore unheated. And then select the second edge, which is the heated part, and I'll say create name selection and wall underscore heated. And so those are all the boundaries where we're going to put boundary conditions. It's also a good idea to label the domain. So I'll go over here to the face selection filter, select the face, and say create name selection, and I'll call this flow domain. So this part of it is optional, but it's a good idea. Otherwise, the solver will give some default name, which can be confusing. And then if I come here, and I can, highlight, I can say Control, Shift, click, and I can highlight all of them and double check that the labels are right. And then I'm going to give boundary conditions on all of these, except of course for the flow domain. That's all there is to labeling the boundaries. So I'll close the mesh, close meshing. And then for the name selections to go into Fluent or into the solver, I have to right click on mesh and say update. After a few seconds, you should see a tick mark under mesh. So we are all set to go into the solver. So I'll say File, Save.